what does the question look like when you're asking about trust in institutions? Because it seems like we're kind of equating it with like support or like happiness with the
No, no,
institution.
no. We shouldn't equate it with support for. So it's basically, how much trust or how much confidence do you have in political parties in this country? Would you say you have a lot of trust, some trust, not very much trust, or no trust at all? That's generally how the question is worded.
Okay, and so that's like just trust in general, not like trust or confidence to like do their job, or trust and confidence to try.
Well, we've got huge numbers of different questions worded in different ways. So a question that's been asked over time repeatedly in the United States is, how much trust do you have in the president, say, or in our national government to do the right thing?
Okay.
That's a little bit different question.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, isn't it necessarily bad to have a low level of trust institutions? Because what if that just reflects some kind of like healthy skepticism for power?
Well, thank you very much. This is why we come back to Sidney Hook. So I'd say what you don't want, here's an interesting methodological challenge. What we tend to do is break this down into trust and distrust. We've got to simplify things, right? There's a massive amount of data. If you're looking at everything, every response on every question for every country, how do you make sense of it all? So we bifurcate, dichotomize these 4 replies into trust and distrust. Maybe it'd be an interesting exercise to see what percentage are saying, I have absolute complete trust, or absolutely no trust at all, versus the 2 middling the responses of some trust, not very much trust. I'd say in the normal democracy, unless you're kind of maybe Sweden or Germany, where in fact you've got high levels of democratic integrity and performance, although even the public's there are becoming more skeptical. But unless you've got, one of the highest functioning democracies by independent evaluation, maybe the healthiest response is if the democracy's working fairly well, you say, I have some trust, I'm not blindly trusting. And the healthiest response is if your democracy's hit a rough patch, well, I have not very much trust, but I'm not alienated from the system. Okay, so let's move on. This is trust in the national government. It's a little bit higher, actually, because the government is performing a little bit, but the levels of distrust, you can add all this up, are still pretty high. Note that the only country that does well here is the country in Latin America that has generally had the highest level of democracy as measured by, say, the Economist Democracy Index, Uruguay. It's just a very liberal, honest, well-functioning democracy, more like kind of the Scandinavian countries. Here are some measures, say, for the national government, the pink line, pink bar from the Asian Barometer a few years ago. And again, the numbers are higher in general, but they're not great. And by the way, this is, as it would be in the US, shaped by partisan biases. So if you've got a left of center government in Korea, the right is going to be much more likely to say, I don't trust the national government very much. If your party's in power, you're going to be much more trusting. So there's that element as well. How much transparency is there in the government? I mean, now you're seeing why there's extensive distrust, cynicism, and maybe kind of erosion of support for democracy. The percentage of Brazilians who say little or no transparency is nearly 80%. Little or no transparency. It's not great in Argentina. It's about 65% who are cynical that way. But again, look at Uruguay, where 60% of Uruguayans in a democracy where independent assessments by, say, Freedom House or the Economist Index point to a liberal, relatively well-governed democracy. People are not dumb, okay? They may be, tempted to respond to populist appeals. They, may be shaped and manipulated by social media. But, you know, there is significant public capacity to perceive what's before them. And here in Uruguay, the best governed of these Latin American, certainly South American democracies, 60% say, yeah, there's a lot or at least some transparency in the country. A little bit better in Ecuador as well. Not very good in Mexico, which has been dominated by extensive corruption, drug trafficking, and organized crime. Better in Chile, again, which also scores high on World Bank or Economist measures of government accountability and performance. To what extent is there a fair distribution of income in the country? And people who are saying there's little fairness guaranteed or none at all is, you know, well over 80% in Brazil. What I was saying to you, again, they're perceiving a reality here, and it's created a vulnerability for democracy if it can't address that. And in Chile now, if you want the answer to the mystery of why a country that institutionally is considered quite a liberal democracy is not evaluated more highly by the citizens, you've got the highest level in Latin America of citizens saying that there's no guarantee at all of a fair distribution of income in the country. Now, I love this data. I mean, not just, I don't love these outcomes necessarily, and I'm not just privileging this slide. I love looking at public opinion data, not only because we learn so much from it, but because it generates a lot of puzzles that really that beg for research. So anybody looking for a senior honors thesis topic, you know, here's a candidate. So you've got one of the most liberal democracies institutionally in Latin America and Chile. You've got only 13-14% saying Chile assures a reasonably fair distribution of income. Not shocking, because very high levels of inequality in Chile. Not nearly as unequal as Brazil, but still it's a more educated society, higher expectations, less kind of in the iron grip of clientelistic, you know, rural and, you know, urban power brokers. So, you know, more demanding in terms of their expectations of fairness in the distribution of income. No other society comes close in Latin America to being so condemning of their distribution of income. Then why, in the most recent presidential election, did they return the right of center party to power in Chile? It's a puzzle. Maybe someone will explore it. Okay, remember we talked about individual political efficacy? This is one way to measure it. You give them two choices. Politics is so complicated that it isn't, you know, easily understood, or politics isn't that complicated, and, you know, I and others like me can understand what's going on. And basically here, these societies are relatively evenly divided in their attitudes on that question and their feelings of personal efficacy. But again, look at Uruguay, where the most liberal democracy has the highest level of political efficacy, and Chile is next, and Argentina is a slightly favorable balance as well. These are generally societies that do not have high levels of interpersonal trust in others. The way we measure that, it's a classic measure that's been used in social, psychological, and political science research for decades. Would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can never be too careful when dealing with other people? Really interesting question. And look at these numbers across Latin America, including Uruguay. 3/4 of the public say you can never be too careful in dealing with other people. And you'll see when we get to Robert Putnam and his famous book, Making Democracy Work, 25 years old. I still think it's one of the best books written in my lifetime in comparative politics about the difference between northern and southern Italy. But generalized social trust is a kind of extremely important building block of civil society, of social capital, and of a kind of healthy, vibrant, responsive, accountable democracy. So if you don't have that, you're not condemned to failure, but one of the kind of favorable conditions is less present. Okay? Yeah?
I just found it earlier data a little bit confusing in terms of socialist regimes because
Socialist regimes?
yes, and
Okay.
like left-handing governments,
Uh-huh.
because that is supposed to be the philosophical promise of leftist or socialist regimes, right? To foster social relations between people and to promote trust between one
Yeah.
another. So it seems interesting that in countries that have either experimented with or still experimenting with left governments, that the social trust between people would be so low.
Well, I'd say your question poses a number of challenges that need to be unpacked, okay? So first of all, we need to define what do we mean by left or socialist governments. If we're talking about democratic socialist, so I'd say Lula da Silva in Brazil and the Workers' Party during the 3+ presidential terms when they were in power would kind of fit that model. So they're respectful of democracy and they're not trying to move the country in an authoritarian direction. And then the question is about their policies. If you're Hugo Chavez or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, the pursuit of socialism comes with the destruction of democracy. And then you wouldn't expect a lot of trust to be welling up and improving because they're taking away people's rights. They're violating, a kind of important element of the traditional social contract of the country. I think another thing to bear in mind is that both the deep cultural element, I'd say probably more difficult to move than attitudes toward political authority, is this general feature of social trust. And the deep social and economic structure of inequality, these things, you can't change them quickly, okay? You can only probably change them incrementally over a long period of time. And think about this. If you have deep, generationally reproduced in a way that's very hard to overcome through social policy, extreme inequality, what would you expect in terms of general social trust? If there's extreme maldistribution of income between the rich and the poor, even more so in rural areas, a huge underclass, probably a lot of crime as a result of there being a huge underclass, and just widespread, relentless social injustice. With that goes, you can read Lipset and you'll see this extreme arrogance on the part of the rich toward the poor. It's not just income, it's status, it's attitudes, that these are inferior people, the heck with them. You kind of play with that social milieu, and we'll get to this soon when we read about the relationship between social and economic inequality and democracy. It's not illogical to expect that general social trust would be lower in that context, and cynicism about everything, about authority, about parties, about institutions, and about your fellow citizens would be much higher. And that is the social reality of southern Italy, Sicily and southern Italy, that Putnam writes about and contrasts to northern Italy in, again, this remarkable book, Making Democracy Work. Okay?